we started meeting from the 1960s onward as a research committee, as a part under a subsection of the Committee on Political Sociology, led by Lipset and Ro Khan, who we've talked about in this course a fair amount. And so we then became a separate research committee of our own after a while, and we started meeting with, we had maybe 50 people over a week, or in a 1-week conference. The first one was in France, southern France. After 20 plus years of meetings with people from around the world working on cities in the context of often political sociology, votes, themes sort of like that. There was an organizer who became the administrator of the director of the sociology section of the National Science Foundation, named Roland Liebert. And he had been to several of our ISA meetings, and he was doing research on how big is the government, that is, especially how big is the local government, and then using that as a way of addressing the bigger question of why do we have strong states that are big or smaller in the sort of Adam Smith minimalist perception. And so one kind of hypothesis from the question we just heard from George about this is, if people are Protestant in religion, and are they more individualistic in their view of the world, would they try to have a smaller state, for example, would be a simple hypothesis here. And then what would that lead to in the ways in which they would see as legitimate or challenge what the state is doing, et cetera. Those are the kinds of ideas that we were talking about. So Liebert talked with this section in political sociology, and the two directors said, there are a couple of big funding programs where things are widely shared, and these in the sociology case, there was the General Social Survey for citizen surveys every year. They get funding for many users. It's not just one researcher, but lots of people doing research on citizens. And then another one was for demography. It was called the 4050 Census Project for demographic research and data. So they said, why don't we start one in the urban area, because there are lots of urban people and there are lots of things going on. And so this was a good time for funding. There was more money around than we have in some different time period. And they encouraged us to hold a conference in Chicago. They went to me because I was chairman of the section. We had we knew the people who were active in the subfields within the urban area, maybe 20 of the top people in the country. Mostly Americans, I guess, because this is a National Science Foundation. This became a proposal to the NSF with about 200 pages worth of, including the backup stuff. It became a book published called Urban Policy Analysis, and Sage published it, and then Ronald Reagan was elected. So the two directors, we had the conference, it went very well. I said, yeah, I'll do a proposal. I said, what sort of budget? Whatever you want, whatever you need to do this. So we laid out a program of things to do. Ronald Reagan was elected. That was the end of 40% of the funding for the National Science Foundation in the social sciences especially. So that idea went out. We talked with each other, and one was Eleanor Ostrom, who later was the first woman to get a Nobel Prize, who was I guess, no, by a non-economist. She's a political scientist in training. But she and I were working with ideas coming from public choice and joining things that cross disciplines about how to theorize, especially how civic groups would work, and if you compare them, how do they work and why do they work? So challenging, thinking about Tocqueville, et cetera. So she had an idea. If we don't have the money, the state is being cut. Civic groups could be more active, or that is, we could break up the state into things that the state could do, the NSF. And so her idea was, what if we each within different states do this big project of many millions of dollars, find little bits of funding, say in the state of California or state of Illinois, and we did, and it worked. We had no central funding. All the money, so we talked about it, and we knew we had a network of, conference, etc. And it became the most extensive set of local government comparisons in the world. That is because it was not just the U.S. We worked in the U.S. so well and so fast in the first year. Several of the Europeans were coming to our meetings, and so they said, yeah, why don't we do this in Europe too? So I said, oh, no, it's too big, it'll be too complicated. They said, well, let's just start it with 3 countries. They started with 3, and then in about a year or 2, it became something like almost all of Western Europe were participating as well. And then after that, Eastern Europe, then Asia, Latin America. Okay. So we were looking then for big questions about where and why are there big. I mean, there are always changes, but we were looking for things that were challenging the size and the scope of government, the kinds of issues that were classified in those terms, which were classically left, right, big versus smaller government, and seated on a table. It was the French national political leaders started the idea of left and right a couple of centuries ago. So we said, this is too simple. Life is not that clear. The parties are doing different things. Citizens want different things. So we argued among ourselves, because more than, I'd say 80% said, no, there's no real change. It's still the left and the right. I and some of the others said, wait a minute, there are important changes. Maybe they're more sensitive to citizens changing within the U.S. because parties are weaker and local governments can also be weaker, and especially in terms of parties. So we said, what we do within the group would be to use some of your own data, and then we actually coming to these meetings, we present results, we disagree, and then we'd try to find things of making the data more comparable. So we said, why don't we collect exactly the same data in each of the countries, in each of the cities? And then, because we disagree in the theories, we disagree on interpretations, and that's fine. These are research ideas. But if the data aren't consistent, we can't test anything systematically. So we said, okay, let's be strict on the methodology, so we can compare Spanish cities, Polish cities, and so forth. At least we ask the mayors, are you in favor of this more or less of the same amount of spending on education, police, and so forth and so forth? And we did. And so basically it worked. and that has gone on. It's published over 50 books. And this was one strong kind of idea. That is, we argued about it. I wrote the book as senior author of a lot of this stuff, but the ideas were 80% not mine. I would say they came from Max Weber, they came from Durkheim, they came from people were arguing about all kinds of things. I put them as propositions that were testable. Instead of just saying, we disagreed, let's try to have a clear, specific question, and then how can we test it with data that we ought to collect, that we can then see these. Okay, so there are about 20 propositions, and and where and why might we have a different kind of government that works, that may make citizens more satisfied? That is, add one more piece. Lipset did a book on trust and showed that trust was going down in the U.S. in many citizen surveys over a couple of decades, say from the 50s and 60s onward, and Putnam has now picked up on this. Trust has just been going down since roughly the 60s in the U.S. initially, and then all around many other countries of the world. But where and why does that vary by city, by neighborhood, or by type of individual? What drives these differences in trust? And is it the Tocqueville hypothesis? If civic participation is not as active and engaged, then maybe that leads people to just stay at home or not be trusting as hypothesized. Putnam then did a survey of metro areas and asked trust and a bunch of other questions across maybe, I think, 50 or so metro areas in the U.S. After he did bowling alone, a lot of people were interested in trying to extend this. So it was probably the biggest question in political science and sociology, dealing with civic questions like this, with testing these kinds of ideas somehow, and how could they be changed? So the metro area that had the lowest level of trust, the fewest people saying they want to be engaged with their neighbors and do things and so forth, were Los Angeles. And that among the Los Angelinos, those who were trusted least tended to be from below the border. They were Mexican, Latin American. But I mean, it wasn't just that, but that was certainly an important factor, both as those individuals, but then many others who were not from Mexico moved away. They didn't want to be so much in the neighborhood, or so that is, many people moved to places, small towns in Nevada and Colorado, Montana and so forth have boomed. And I mean, this wasn't just a little bit, this is like 30-40% of the population. Lots of people moved out. And now you see the current debates, especially in Europe, but now this is swept here as well. Immigration and differences in terms of religion have become more and more salient. Okay, so this is right on target. Where and why is this happening? And so there was a foundation group that said, why don't we do so? Well, then we had Hollywood and the San Fernando Valley, just north of LA, said, we want to withdraw from the whole government. We don't want to be part of LA anymore. We want to be ourselves. We want to have something different. And about 40% of the citizens said, yes, we're against this, but not quite enough. So the Los Angeles leaders said, okay, well, Tocqueville says, have more local responsiveness. And so let's create some neighborhoods, some smaller regions, because there are only something like 10 or so city council members for all of LA. Chicago has 50, and so they had about 90 little neighborhood city halls in a sense. But they in turn were and became very different. Some of them were openly clientelist, and I was at a meeting with about 100 people, maybe 50 of whom were elected officials from these local groups. And so some would say, yes, we have, and so we'd say, what's the turnout? How many citizens elected you? And 250 people. How many live in this area? Maybe 30,000. So they had very low turnout. And they had openly clientelist patterns of leadership. And they would say, we want to have more budget, more authority, because we want to do it the right way. And they saw in some of these presidents, the officers, would refer directly to the way things are done in Mexico. We have one party, it's a hierarchy, it's a strong party system, it works well, let's do it now here. And we will, basically just repeating what I wrote about in the Irish Ethic paper. Okay. other people in the same meeting, and then we had several years of data, several years of surveys being done by people at USC, University of Southern California, had this conference. The top experts said, we've got to have more decentralization, and if that doesn't work, we don't know what the problem is, because Tocqueville doesn't tell us that this is the way they were at least using Tocqueville. Okay, my answer was, let's not just argue about Tocqueville, which is basically what Putnam is doing. Let's look below south of the border and see what variations we can find. That is, not everybody in Mexico is distrusting. There are differences there. So I'm not an expert on Latin America, so I asked some people who knew more than I. What's going on in Latin America where there are some interesting cities, interesting countries? And the answer is Mockus. Okay, let's take a look at this.
When should I start?
Right now, yeah, just right at the start.
Colombia.
Bogota, Colombia. The most Spanish city in Latin America, closest explicitly to Spain. But they were also had a war going on.
That's Medellin, the war.
Something like, well, okay, it went on and on and on. But basically, it was still going on here. Read the subtitles carefully. Move it further back and read it.
What?
Just enough to be just type. Okay, that's good.
Se metieron al bus a robarnos los celulares, los bolsos, y entonces entre la gente cogimos el man y no dejamos robar y nos apuñaló.
Con la policía, y no me da pena decirte, porque aquí la policía se presta también, con el perdón suyo, se presta para esta situación.
Aquí yo seamos, sí, pobres, pero seamos buena gente. Colabórenos, ayúdenos, señor alcalde.
This is Colombia in the early 1990s. At that time, Bogota was a city in urban decay. The newsreels of the time show a metropolis that was rightly called the worst city on the planet. Drug cartels, poverty, murder and corruption infected every aspect of life, and the citizens had lost any faith in their leaders. But in 1994, a political metamorphosis began that would turn the society upside down. New politicians, with radically new methods, transformed the metropolis at a speed that no one could have imagined in their wildest dreams. Hidden in the Colombian archives lays dormant a beautiful story about crazy, extraordinary politicians who transformed the lives of Bogota's 8 million people.
At my home, always the issue was the conflict. The way cities were built would determine, to a large extent, equality, social justice, happiness for millions of people for many generations. And I became more and more interested in this.
Con niños así como estos, y para ellos, tenemos que hacer una Bogotá que no solamente sea más segura, que tenga buenos sistemas de transporte, sino que también sea más hermosa y que sea más feliz.
Por quinta vez, Enrique Peñalosa se ausentó de los foros para candidatos a la alcaldía. Salimos a buscarlo, pues sus contrincantes lo reclaman. Y lo encontramos haciendo campaña en las calles de Bogotá. Según Peñalosa, le rinde más visitando restaurantes, almacenes y repartiendo folletos.
I did something which had never been done in Colombian politics. I started to go from home to home and I started to distribute papers in the street, these little leaflets. This had never been done in Colombian politics.
This election campaign would become the turning point for Bogota. Enrique Peñalosa, a young promising politician from the Liberal Party, was a frontrunner early on. He had dreamt his entire life of implementing a radically new urban philosophy. But this time, it wasn't Peñalosa who would turn the society upside down.
Mockus.
¿Por qué monto en bicicleta para llegar a la rectoría? Para conservar integridad, para mantener mi identidad toda unida.
And Mockus was rector at the National University. The crisis in society at large had created an extreme radicalization among students. FARC rebels and anarchists would daily confront the rector, who was known for his unorthodox methods of conflict resolution. But one day, in front of 2,000 demonstrating students, his unorthodox methods would shock the entire country. Many believe that the transformation of Bogota began right there, at that moment.
Yo había asistido a esa escena, no conmigo, sino con otras personas a las que el público había chiflado todo el año. Y yo me había dicho, yo nunca pasaré por esa humillación, algo haré. Yo creo que la emoción fue muy parecida a la que puede sentir una persona que se pone muy violenta. Tal vez muchos asesinos sienten eso, que no pueden sobrevivir a la humillación del momento. Tienen que hacer algo. Lo que hice conecta dos extremos, extreme contempt y extreme submission.
Llegué a mi casa muy cansada, me llamó una amiga y yo tenía la televisión, la tenía en mute, estaba mirando las imágenes pero no estaba oyendo. Cuando abren el noticiero y Antana se pone la mano en la cintura, dije yo, le dije yo a mi amigo, ¡ay! Antana se va a bajar los pantalones. Entonces me dijo, sí, se los bajó.
¿Pero usted no cree que más bien eso es un mal ejemplo, que un rector haga eso delante de sus estudiantes?
Es muy probablemente un mal ejemplo, pero les garantizo que lo que vieron fue color de paz, blanco.
No estoy de acuerdo con el gesto del rector Mockus porque me parece innecesario y además de mal gusto. Yo creo que no le queda otra salida a él que renunciar.
Que si se llamaría ese trabajo, se motivara a votar, entonces es mucho más grande.
The mooning incident becomes a national scandal, and Mockus is forced to resign his position. But among the general public, he becomes a symbol of honesty.
A los pocos días, un congresista de izquierda, caminando por un caminito, se encontró con un campesino y le preguntó, ¿usted quién cree que debe ser alcalde? Y el campesino dijo, el loco de Mantanas.
Mockus' sudden popularity inspires him to run for mayor. Against all tradition, he runs as an independent without support from any political party.
Soy un hombre independiente.
Mockus soon becomes Peñalosa's strongest opponent.
made like a poll where people would vote for him, and everybody would vote for him. He had become a suddenly superstar.
¿Para qué?
Pues para que la ciudad sea bella como la quisiéramos.
Así lo recibió la gente en la calle. Con sus propias supermanos llevó la basura al sitio donde debería estar, no en las calles de Bogotá. Con sus superpiernas se subió a un muro para mostrarnos la contaminación visual que debe ser prohibida en vallas, en edificios y en casas.
La campaña funcionaba en la casa de Antanas, que era chiquita, la casa de la mamá. Antanas vivía con la mamá. La mamá de Antanas es un personaje completamente fuera de serie, absolutamente singular. O sea, Antanas es una persona común y corriente al lado de su mamá. Es una magnífica escultora. Ni Yole no quería que Antanas fuera político.
Yo entré a la casa de Antanas vivía con su mamá, y la señora sale y me mira y me dice, ¿usted quién ser? Ella es lituana y habla un español mezclado. Entonces yo le digo, soy un periodista de QAP Noticias. ¿Qué querer en mi casa? Entonces Antanas viene corriendo, no mamá, él va a hacer un directo. ¿Qué es un directo? No, viene una antena y salimos en directo. Oh, ok, salirse de mi casa, señor.
Es decir, era una campaña completamente fuera de lo común. En la casa de la mamá del alcalde, la mamá del alcalde insultaba a los periodistas, no los dejaba entrar. Todo era contrario a las formas normales de hacer la política.
Nosotros vamos a hacer todos los esfuerzos para poder influir en la construcción de la...
The 1994 campaign was certainly different. Peñalosa fought for his political vision, but the public was in no mood for politics. Their anger and discontent inclined them more towards a loose cannon like Mockus. Some voters, though, were beyond reach.
He threw excrements in our face. Dog excrements or human or cow or what, but it was not very pleasant.
Pues él habló y cuando me tocó el turno hablar, un estudiante me quitó el micrófono. En ese momento perdí los estribos. ¿Sí?
The only thing I can remember to think is I have to be here. I'm not going to live here because I'm not going to be a coward. Nobody hit me. The fight was going around. It was like in the movies, and some people would fall in this hole where the orchestra plays and things like in the movies.
Los hechos ocurridos en el día de ayer en la Universidad Nacional entre un grupo de estudiantes y los precandidatos a la alcaldía, Antanas Mockus y Enrique Peñalosa, lo hacen sentir a usted más inclinado o menos inclinado a votar por Antanas Mockus. Más inclinado a votar por Mockus, 54%. Menos inclinado...
Yo mismo en Bogotá manejando me vuelvo un guacha. Manejo no de manera decente, vuelve uno agresivo. Entonces uno empieza a pensar cómo hacer para ir bajando la agresividad de unos y de otros.
Me, I have been doing some politics which were totally anti-traditional politics for years. You know, with my little papers in the streets, without doing any alliances with anybody, without paying 1 cent for any vote, nothing. But next to what Mockus represented, I all of a sudden became a traditional politician.
Tal vez represento hasta cierto punto a la gente que durante mucho tiempo ha mirado con mucho escepticismo la política.
Antanas Mockus barrió con sus opositores y hoy es el alcalde electo de Bogotá, con una de las votaciones mayores que se recuerde en la capital.
Y un hombre que no existía, digamos, para el mundo político unos meses atrás, se volvió un gran fenómeno de opinión y con unos pocos centavos, lo cual es realmente un caso excepcional en el mundo.
In these things, you know, what I have seen is that sometimes there is a need for some kind of people, and maybe the voters are wiser than you think. I don't know.
Antanas Mockus takes office on January 1st, 1995 as the first independent mayor in Bogota's history. He enters a city hall that has for years been dominated by corruption and nepotism. As an independent, Mockus owes no political favors and puts together his administration based on qualification alone, handpicking the brightest minds of the country. The invasion of the academics has begun.
En la dignidad de cada persona se une esa semilla de moral y esa preocupación por responder ante los otros. La dignidad.
With a background in philosophy, Mockus turns Bogota into an experiment in political theory. According to him, there is a disparity between culture, law, and morality in Colombia. People throw garbage on the street because it's morally acceptable, or people act violently because the culture does not condemn it. Mockus wants to change people's morality.
Change the morality.
A partir de ese momento, Antanas comienza a hablar sobre temas de ciudad de la
How many
conocía
mayors ever say that?
conocía de temas filosóficos generales, sobre los consensos en la sociedad, pero su experticia no era eso, ni mucho menos.
I think that he was very clear that through education, if he educated people and people were behaving in a different way, then the city would transform itself.
Hay una cosa que se trabajó en la 19 que es la persona que se mete en el nudo en la intersección. Pues el que no quiso esperar el siguiente turno y obstaculizó, esa persona yo creo que merecería la tarjeta roja.
Todas estas actitudes que para quienes viven en Bogotá ya son pan de cada día, serán en adelante sancionadas.
El que se queda, aunque tiene espacio vacío al frente para que puedan pasar los otros, hace mostrarle la tarjeta blanca. A medida que afinemos ese diagnóstico, podremos dar el mensaje social de qué comportamientos son los que más impacto tienen sobre la congestión.
Ustedes ven allí la mampara es el sitio donde puede haber un policía o puede haber un ciudadano cualquiera. Cuando un conductor ve a un ciudadano cualquiera asomado allí, no sabe si es un policía o no es un policía. Es la máxima expresión de la autorregulación.
Yo decía, estos son 6 millones de habitantes. Estos juegos no logran transformar comportamientos. Yo tenía una actitud bastante incrédula frente a eso.
No fue fácil, estaba rodeado de muchas incomprensiones. La gente intuía que él iba para alguna parte, pero no sabían muy bien para dónde.
Yo recuerdo que cuando él inventó los mimos, la prensa se reía de Antanas.
Estos largos y oscuros túneles ubicados bajo el centro de Bogotá, se preparan 20 jóvenes que pretenden enseñarles a los habitantes de la ciudad cómo vivir civilizadamente en una capital.
Es a través del arte, ¿sí? A través de nuestra postura de la estética y de la ética, vamos a poner en servicio nuestro trabajo para dar educación ciudadana.
Creo que la disposición a dejarse corregir es el complemento que espero frente a los mimos. O sea, los mimos solos no bastan. Ahora necesitamos que la gente acepte al mimo.
Y es sumamente interesante ver cómo poco a poco va calando la idea porque es una idea que no se basa exclusivamente en el show.
Personas que hasta el día anterior no lo respetaban y no los atemorizaba la fuerza de la autoridad, la multa, empezaron a cumplir eso.
It seemed like a crazy idea, but the traffic mimes become a great success. Mockus decides to disband the notoriously corrupt traffic police. He lets 3,200 officers go. Out of them, 400 take up his offer to be re-educated as mimes. But the police commissioners deny corruption and pressure Mockus to stop the program.
Entonces estaba yo con el secretario de tránsito, el general de la policía y los representantes de los policías corruptos locales. Y yo le dije al hombre, mira, yo saldría a los medios y diría lo que usted me está pidiendo que diga, siempre y cuando usted crea lo que me está diciendo. Entonces, para yo creerle a usted lo que usted me está diciendo, usted me va a repetir lo que usted quiere que yo diga mirándome a los ojos. Entonces digo, ¿qué? Le dije yo, que me diga qué es lo que yo tengo que decir mirándome a los ojos. Y cada vez que el hombre llegaba a decir que no eran corruptos, el hombre me bajaba la mirada. Le dije yo, primera vez, no fue capaz. Vuelva a ver si es capaz de decirme. Segunda vez, no. Tercera vez le dije yo, se acabó la reunión. Por su corrupción, se acabó este negocio. Se pueden ir para sus casas y nos vemos en los tribunales.
Okay, you get the flavor. Labeling it, adding the arts, which we've been talking about, citizens mobilizing up, no parties, in this case extreme, entrepreneurial leaders wearing, a Superman outfit, coming up with these kinds of things. He then was so successful, he ran for president of Colombia. He had 40% of the support with citizens. Then there were enough stuff with the civil war going on that they did elect a guy who was a tougher on fighting. So he did not get elected president, but Peñalosa, who was his competitor, was elected and continued some of the same kinds of things as Mockus. So the ideas are there, and this film gives you some of this, and he and Peñalosa then, when they had limited terms, either 1 or 2 terms. They've been teaching at NYU, at Oxford, traveling around the world, and discussing, what can we do to mobilize citizens and have dramatically new policies, including what you've seen here. There are all kinds of things which they did, which were studied, and so this in turn is an example of the new political culture. There are hundreds of things like this around the world, and so there were things. The mayors, Tokyo, Montreal, were elected against all the traditional strong parties. Mexico was a strong party system for decades, and again, not as extreme as Mockus, but for example, in Mexico City, they adapted one of Mockus's ideas. We've got crime all the time. What can we do to change it, especially at night? And the murders are mostly leaving bars and men fighting for women. So they said, okay, let's have a women's only night out. No men. 0 murders. The mayor of Mexico said, women policemen can give traffic tickets, but no men can give traffic tickets. We just want a cash return. Okay, so these kinds of policies have been changing around the world, not everywhere. Sometimes we just have violence, we just have the old traditions. But the general point here is we've got, and this is where we are now. Let's go through, please, the main points we have. I'm going to build on what I presented to the people in Colombia. That is, Mockus invited me. They had about 10 experts from Colombia.
You met Mockus?
Yes, with Mockus.
You met him personally?
Yes, yeah. No, I was there for several days. And there were 2 foreigners, me and an Israeli. The Israeli was an expert on clientelism. He'd written 2 books on clientelism. I had just finished this book, I think, at this point. So I went there and I said, okay, let's talk about this and let's discuss it with Mockus himself personally. So let's go some of the main points. Scroll down just a little bit more. Okay, so that was the. 12 points. So let's look mainly at the headings. Well, let's just scroll down. There's a lot of text here, but this is a summary of the book, really. Let's get the headings. Post-industrial society. The new economy relies more on ideas, high-tech innovation, R&D, design, creation of new. Okay, so on down, please. Globalization, competition nationally and internationally has undermined the city as a growth machine. The business regime of Karl Marx, Floyd Hunter, Clarence Stone has declined and is increasingly international. And so the old style of clientelist business certainly was and is true in some places, but in China, the biggest issue of, I would say, of government, of domestic government and definitely local governments is what they call corruption. And so the way it was in Bogota, they're not always obviously doing as revolutionary things as in Bogota, but the challenge of these global patterns is leading to big change. Local personal ties decline. Okay, next. Individual citizens rise in importance. Traditional hierarchy declines, etc. Number 5. Let me stop. Just add the box. What is neoliberalism? It's widely used in Latin America and in Eastern Europe. What is neoliberalism? And they use terms related neocolonialism, neoliberal, thereby playing down politics, culture, and social issues. The term neoliberal, widely used in Latin America, often seems misplaced, yet it applies to fiscal and economic policies, but ignores the social policies. Recent mayors of Bogota have explicitly taxed the rich to help the poor, sought to empower average citizens and done many things that powerfully distinguish them from simple neoliberal defines in classic fiscal terms. Okay, so that's the problem with neoliberalism is it taught that many people and many new presidents, new mayors were elected, and they say, I'm going to break the rules. We're not going to have left-right anymore. We'll cut taxes, but they don't. So Chile was an example, or it was cited as a mistake of being neoliberal, following Milton Friedman, and only talking about money, taxes, and the like. Whereas what Mockus is doing is dealing with much more social issues, crime, murder, etc. Defining positive ways of doing things, and finding some policies like the MIMES, women who can potentially act differently, etc. Showing everybody that if women can do this, maybe men can do it as well. But they fired all the traffic policemen. They hired the MIMES instead, and it worked. Okay. Political leaders can make a difference. Key individuals crystallize these changes, and these are some of the big names. Issue-specific politics grows stronger and replaces party programs. Cosmopolitanism and irony rise as people's status sets and expand. The idea of you can be a worker and a church organizer and a political party leader, And these different status sets multiply in number and harder to classify a single citizen in terms of one issue. There are multiple issues that affect all of us. And so if we begin to look at that and think about how this works, then we can transform the political, and this has been happening around the world. The rise of issue politics, the decline of parties, the rise of the media. Internationally, citizens in Europe, the US, and Japan are broadly similar in supporting these NPC issues. But the organized groups differ, especially in Japan. They are weaker, and in the US, they're much stronger, for instance. But the surveys of citizens around the world show the degrees of movement in the same direction. 9, parties still dominate in Western Europe. But they're getting weaker, and then after I wrote this, we had the collapse of the whole Italian and French party system, and we had totally new parties, and the first visitor of the president of China is coming to France because he's the leader at this point. Now, what's going to happen, who knows? But this is I mean. That's a powerful example, and he is president of France now, is the closest sort of national leader in Europe, illustrating something in that direction of Mockus. Consumption replaces production politics. Okay, down next. So I'll just mention we've done about 10 books that test these ideas in different ways. How do you test? We have different books use drastically different methodologies. So this is the theory, the background, and some basic beginnings of testing. Then we have other books. One's called The Urban Innovation, and that's about mayors in the U.S. This one has data on mayors and citizens nationally. Another book is on citizens internationally. So I'm drawing on each of these multiple things. Then I did a book with Daniel Elazar called, basically, he died, we didn't finish it, so it's scattered in different places of our work. But what you were asking about was evangelical Protestantism and so forth, or I just mentioned. Evangelical Protestantism across Africa and Latin America has replaced past religions to a drastic way. Even in Brazil, there are more people who go to evangelical churches on Sunday in Brazil than to the Catholic churches in Brazil. Okay, so that's a sign that things are changing. 11, I'm down to what changes political culture? Drivers of the NPC. Okay, so then let's just go on down. Consciously adding morality to public policy to label lawbreakers as morally bad. Okay, onward. Second, related to adding morality is defined as the public good or the commonwealth as a shared resource that must be cultivated by all. So I'm not using the terms Samuelson and his term, his technical definition, but I'm giving you a broader way, and this is also in Habermas. Habermas talks about introduction of the public good and the commonwealth. He uses the same terms in talking about which we've discussed. Growing out the trend. Just look at the broad classes of policies, new issues, productivity improvement, empowering citizens. 4. Representing new social groups, the diversity groups of name here, replacing clientelist contacts. 5. 6, use the media to reach individual citizens outside the traditional parties. Okay, that's our overview story.
Can I interrupt for a question?
Go ahead. Yes. I'd say we can more or less add questions. I can bring in a lot more detail, but I've given you the overview.
Okay, I do have an issue with morality, you know, because he spoke about, you know, is teaching citizens.
The tripod, separate the two a little bit more, so that the camera doesn't get hit.
No, it's not getting hit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm pointing at.
You're going the other way. Okay. Yes. Excuse me. You're right. Apologies. Question is.
So, the question is about morality. Mockus talk about morality and changing the morality of the people, right? And my question to you is, what's the difference between defining morality, defining what's good and bad, and the work that you did with religion, which is basically religion also says what's right and what's wrong, yeah? So are they actually replacing religion with new morality?
Yeah, I'd say the simple answer is that in the past, morality came from the political system and especially the leadership. So take from the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, and then from the 19th century onward from the state. And so these big hierarchical institutions define the law and the legal right of good and bad. Okay, the new morality is not to say that the state and the law and the church, the official church, have defined law and good. That's fine in the way they define it, but if instead what Mockus and the others are doing is going not from the top but from the bottom, going to average citizens and say, what do you feel is right or wrong? And so the average citizen is the source of the new morality, is the quick, simple answer. And so to ask what is right in terms of your family, the way you know with your neighbors, what you feel is right. And in the case of Bogota, the vast majority of the city council members were very closely connected to the gangsters, the importers, and the people selling drugs internationally. That's what really drove the economy of much of the country, and certainly the city council members, but Mockus did not. And so the city council, so he had minimal support in the city council. So how could he get anything? And the same thing was true in Chicago with Harold Washington. He had a minority in the city council, and in many cases like this with these new mayors, and I ended up being a consultant for many of these, because they, what do? You don't have any votes, you don't do them in the normal way, and so what they'll often use the media and then do things that were making a clear, big, visible statement to the average citizen, and the mobilization of citizens rather than party leaders, church leaders, top civic groups, business groups, and so forth. This tends to lead, for instance, to say, if people are taking a bribe for speeding or asking for a bribe, that you get the ticket unless you give them a bribe, that's wrong. That's the kind of thing that Mockus was especially capturing with the example, as did the mayor of Mexico, and not only letting women give traffic tickets as police. I mean, that's the quick, simple answer. So I mean, the serious answer is, look at the book edited by me and Mike Rempel, and the whole book is on citizen preferences, with chapters by us, by analyzing a bunch of original data, and then bringing in some experts on this, writing other chapters in other countries around the world. Question?
So, I know of this Mexican politician who, a lot of citizens have firearms, whether illegally or not, but his whole point was, I understand that if I reduce the presence of firearms within the general population, there will probably be less, crime. This is from, I think, mid-2010s to late 2010s. And I know that his whole kind of captivating phrase was using, for your family voluntary disarmament, which I'm guessing is, could this count under the new political culture, using family and using that as an incentive to give up the firearm? I know that he also used economic incentives, but I guess family is also part of older political cultures. How do we parse those two together, where like you're using innovative ways to mobilize citizens, but you're perhaps using concepts that come from older political cultures.
Okay, excellent question. I would say yes, exactly. The idea of having families give up their guns voluntarily is a powerful, visible act, which and requesting from the mayor that way to try to reduce the visibility of guns. A similar kind of thing, bringing in the fiscal with the non-fiscal, was Mockus said, you can pay your normal taxes in Bogota, but if you would like to make a contribution to us to try to do more, please just pay your taxes and 30% more. And there were hundreds of thousands, I don't know the exact number, but large numbers of people paid more than because they thought the mayor was really doing the right thing. So in that sense, the fiscal incentives could go the other way. See, that the citizens can show endorsing these policies and new social, crime, and other kinds of issues through the vote. That is not just by implementing a tax, but giving this individual citizen the right to choose whether or not how much to pay, which again shows the appeal to the citizen in that same kind of moralistic labeling. Other themes. I gave lectures on this around the world, including, say, Japan, Western Europe. Well, it's, again, still most of the Western Europeans and the experts said we still have mainly class politics. This is simply wrong. 10 years later, more and more people have moved in this direction. Japan and Korea, we had many debates and discussions, and that in turn led to the book called Kentucky Karaoke. But let me ask our expert of citizens of new issues, PhD on a new issue in China. Any follow-up questions we want to ask about how these kinds of issues can be studied or how might be interpreted within China? These debates from Putnam, from Mockus, we have a book here, but I'm saying millions of people are talking about the same thing, including inside China.
I think it's quite funny because in terms of the nature of the regime, China is a communist country, communist state dominated by a one-party ruling. So, technically speaking and ideologically speaking, there should be no class issue in China in the first place because it is ruled by a communist party. And in terms of the class politics, so this sort of class tension should be eliminated by a so-called communist regime. But my feeling is that in the recent years, I think it's quite contrary to the Western European and the United States. The class issues are actually they are in the rise in China. I think like the CCP would rather people focus on the new so-called new political culture or like this kind of new issues rather than like focus on the class politics or class issues. But my feeling is particularly with the younger generations, the millennials and the Gen Z, they are more, I have to say, they are more class conscious than their predecessors, than their former generations in the era of ordinary reform. I think it is, we are kind of approaching the sort of breaking point of a more, I don't know, like, I think it's kind of like the Weimar Germany. So people on one hand, the class consciousness or the class conflicts are in the rise, but on the other hand, people are increasingly nationalistic. So it's kind of complicated.
What do you mean by nationalistic?
Nationalistic, yeah.
What do you mean?
I mean the sentiment of this kind of sentiment of anti-West.
Anti-West.
Yeah. Or like the irredentism. Irredentism. Yeah. We are going to take back Taiwan.
I'd say one way that we've often tried to deal with a situation like this, you raised a different interpretation, and so clearly there are grounds for exploration somehow. How to deal when we have open, clear, specific intellectual conflicts, and what I've tried to encourage, excuse me, and maybe as a takeaway for you in the course, how to deal with this, whether it's people in your dormitory, people in people people in a coffee discussion. If you can try to get a specific idea, such as class differences may be rising in China compared to social issues, then what the follow-up question can be, how can we test the relative importance of each of these, and for sure we're going to have class issues, or that is, and those can then be operationally measured as differences in income. They can be in terms of questions such as, who do you identify yourself with? Are you part of the upper class, the middle class? And so in the U.S. sometimes they've used 6 classes, upper, and so forth. And then generally what we're finding and then how much are people sorting them into different kinds of classes? That's another way, which has been a subjective rather than an objective kind of measure. But how do we then, if we have issue areas, as we've talked about here as part of this new political code, we can try to say how important are the different issue areas, and how can one trade off or find either examples of leaders like a mayor, or at least or a party program, or a public intellectual that tries to say, how can we join the two? So Tony Blair and Bill Clinton basically said, vote for us. We're both from the leftist party. I'm the Labour Party in England, or the Democratic Party in terms of Bill Clinton. But then they changed the relationship between fiscal and social issues. So in the traditional left, so we sometimes put up 4 boxes up there: left, right on social issues and fiscal issues. The traditional parties of the left and right would be high on liberal, but that is, if you have low taxes, then you have more concerns for social issues, left to the individual, if you will, or a label would be, if you're Reagan, you're said, pick yourself up by your own bootstraps and you can improve in life, and that can be true of your job, your income, and your firearms and so forth. Whereas so I'm giving you 4 types of politics here to simplify, which you've heard me talk about, and they're in this book and they're elsewhere. Traditional left, traditional right. The third is ethnic politics, and much of this used to be 20 years ago, 30 with African Americans in the U.S. Basically, what was called affirmative action was ideally to follow universalistic standards, which we talked about with the Ivy League admitting African Americans, but not ignoring the Jews. As said, let's let anybody in who really does well in the exams, whether they're Jewish or black, and if they're the son or daughter of a Yale alumnus, we're not going to give them special privilege anymore. So in that sense, that's in a sense ethnic politics, his movement of saying support that affirmative action has become more like traditional ethnic politics. If he's Irish, we let him in, etc. For the case of the Democratic Party in Chicago, led by the Irish leadership, or etc. By contrast, the fourth type we call a new political culture. And these are people who really are socially liberal, as you can see with Mockus. But he didn't play it up there. But Mockus was fiscally conservative. He did not raise taxes. In that sense, he was like Blair and Clinton and many other leaders who were not really raising, that is, the Chinese. I'll ask a question I've learned from previous teaching assistants. How large is the welfare state, and how much do hospital, doctors, social services, retirement, how generous are these in China compared to Western Europe or the US?
That's quite complicated. So in terms of healthcare, the systems of healthcare in China is a sort of parallel systems. So you can have a certain group of social and political elites. They are basically affiliated with the state, and this a rather small group of people, they can enjoy universal healthcare for free. And for the rest of the citizens, which composes the majority of the people in the country, they have to pay for their healthcare. So it is not a corporate healthcare system like the United States. It's not a private healthcare system. It's a healthcare system moderated by the state, provided by the state. But you have paid for your own healthcare based on your. That's quite complicated. Based on your identity, in which case, or whether you are a rural citizen, rural resident, or an urban resident, and which province you reside in. For instance, like if you reside in Shanghai, you can have a better healthcare system.
If you're a legal resident.
Yeah, of course.
If you're a farmer and you're a son of a farmer and you go to Shanghai, you still only have a rural resident. You break your arm. What happens?
Yeah, you have to
pay yourself.
Yeah, pay yourself.
Okay.
I think only a small amount of your medical bill will be covered by your local healthcare.
So I mean, the simple bottom line is the Chinese have many fewer simple welfare services than does Western Europe. U.S. is in between, but it depends.
Yeah, I think the healthcare system in China and the one in U.S. they suck in different ways. So, but yeah.
But I'm only bringing that in as an example as the welfare state is an intermediary between the fiscal and the social, and so it's what the national government does or does not, and so as we go further to get to things like transferring or say asking citizens to give up their guns, or affirmative action for women, requiring, as the president of Harvard was doing, following the spirit of this in the national government, if the anthropology department wants to hire and they don't have a woman candidate, the president directly went to the chairman of the anthropology department and said, you must hire a woman, and etc. So that kind of social issue rising, as in the case of women here, is a new introduction. That is, it's not a simple fiscal issue. That is the social issue of gender, women, African Americans, sexual preferences. These kinds of social issues have become explicitly addressed as distinct issue areas, and they're not determined by if you're rich or poor or highly educated or not. in ways that were or are assumed, if you follow the term, neoliberal. So in that sense, that's not directly getting at the point you raised, which is clearly a big important issue, but it's closer. That is, it's close to the debates which have been going on, which are going on right now. Is how much do we still have the classic left-right issues, and how much should the redistribution be more important? So in working with Lipset, we then look for some survey data, and found, for instance, if we have the same, if we look at, there are many questions asking exactly on your point. that is really a third kind of way of trying to capture how important are class issues. If we look at, say, one question: how much should the government, national government, help the disadvantaged be assisted more? How much should the government try to move toward more equality in income? It's a different way of asking the questions. I think there are about 5 questions like that have been pretty widely used with the World Values Survey, the International Social Survey Program, the GSSP, and so forth. And you can find, for instance, that African Americans are more in favor of more redistribution than are non-African Americans. Okay, that would seem to be supporting the point that class politics is still there among African Americans. But if you then compare lower income African Americans with upper income Italians, which is more in favor of having the state redistribute income to help the disadvantaged? Do rich Italians say more, same, or less than poor African Americans?
Yes.
Yes, meaning what?
I mean, the African American will like to have more distribution, yeah?
Yeah, redistribution. Yeah, more toward to help the poor, having government help poor people.
Yeah. While the rich Italian will say it's up to you.
Okay. Answer's wrong. That's what's interesting. Rich Italians look at their survey results. They more often say the state should help the poor people more. More often do the rich Italians say that than do the poor, or the poor and all African Americans. So that's the opposite of what you would certainly think intuitively in terms of left-right and redistribution. So I'm not trying to say there is a right or a wrong. What I'm trying to do is transfer the general point about the salience of class to then to try to say, let's break it up into welfare, into, say, taxes, income. That is, I hesitate to at least to add a footnote right there. If we look at where and how much people are differing based on income, is that largely in, let's say, well, largely, who determines how much income people get? Depends on the job. That is, if you have essentially, or say within China, we have the capitalist part of the Chinese economy. Say you open a cafe yourself, you work in a private movie theater, you sell a little restaurant, you set up a little restaurant or a cafe. These are private sector capitalist kinds of dynamics that largely drive this in China. Whereas if you work for a social worker or for the government or for postal, deliver service, deliver the mail and so forth, then you're a government official. So in that simple sense, your income is explained by what the government is paying. Whereas if the capitalist sector has generally, and certainly after the collapse of the 1989, the Berlin Wall, much of the economy shifted toward the private sector in Hungary, Poland, and so forth. And income inequality increased. And there was enough of a sense, so in a sense I'm giving you an example that would support your suggestion. The parties that then, after they had the next elections, after, maybe 4 years, 2 years, 4 years after 1989, the people in the Czech Republic elected communists number one. They didn't have a majority, but they did have a plurality. There were more votes that went to the Communist Party, and the most things that were, the issues that were most frequently discussed were saying there's income inequality has increased since we have communism is no longer here, so let's vote back, and they did vote back in the communists. So in that sense, the average citizens in the Czech Republic wanted more equality of income, but where and why, who determines that, increased perhaps, and this may have been the same thing in the last 20, 30 years within China, which has introduced a section of the economy driven more by capitalist dynamics. And probably many of these, although there are also children, this is a lot have been in the press, the children of some very high level party people or government people in China are also very, very affluent. And so in that sense, I'm not looking for any right answer. I'm trying to look at ways of stating a proposition and then saying, most of all, where and why does the proposition hold? Where and why do we have more income? And so your answer to my question about where do we have more welfare state services, your answer was the context depends. So for instance, if you're living in Shanghai as a citizen, or if you're a rural resident living in Shanghai, but you're not a citizen, then you have to pay yourself. Whereas if you're working for the government, living in Shanghai, then you get good welfare state hospital services. So in that sense, your answer depends on the context. So I'm saying that's a useful answer, because instead of saying one is right and one is wrong, everywhere the question is where and why do we have more income? Where do income inequality? Where and why do we have more? And there's so here in this book, but also in the next book we'll talk about on Wednesday, in Scenescapes, we look at a lot of issues which involve inequality and where and how these get redefined in terms of social and fiscal issues. But we're at the end of our time and we should quit for now. So thank you for asking good questions, and let's look for more as we're reading and try to keep joining these with other discussions. This is not just in the classroom. These issues are being fought right outside in the streets. Okay.